Case Report. OCUP Med Vol 50 Number 1, EP 49-56 2000. Copyright signed 2000 Lippincott Williams and Wilkins for Somme, printed in Great Britain. All rights reserved. 962-7480/00. Effects of exposure to very high frequency radio frequency radiation on 6 antenna engineers in 2 separate incidents. C.J. Schilling, 39 St. David's Square, Westferry Road, London, E14 War, UK. 6 men are likely to have been accidentally exposed to high levels of very high-frequency VHF radio frequency radiation 100 MHz, while working on transmission masts. 4 men in one incident and 2 in another. They experienced symptoms and signs which included headache, paresthesia, diarrhea, malaise and lassitude. The condition of 4 men, 2 men from each incident likely to have had the highest exposure, has shown no significant improvement. The first incident occurred in 1995, and the second in 1996. Keywords: antenna, radio frequency UHF, VHF. OCUP Med Vol 50 49-56 2000. Received 15 Few 1999, accepted in final form, 16 September 1999. Introduction. There are no reports in the literature of the effects of acute exposure to VHF radio frequency, although there are reports of the effects of exposure to microwaves 300 MHz-300 GHz. In 1997 I described an episode of acute exposure to ultra-high frequency UHF radio frequency radiation 785 MHz mean frequency, which occurred in 1993, and outlined the effects of radio frequency radiation at various frequencies, and reviewed the literature. Reports from Eastern Europe referred to symptoms of lassitude, fatigue and headache. Hocking reported that mobile phone users suffered from unpleasant burning sensations on the side of the head when using a mobile phone 900 MHz. Braun and Rock-Large reported increases in resting blood pressure in subjects in a single-blind, placebo-controlled exposure to mobile phones 900 MHz GSM, and postulated an increase in sympathetic efferent activity, resulting in vasoconstriction. Hyland suggested that microwaves may cause frequency-specific non-thermal effects in humans based on the results of so-called microwave resonance therapy and on effects on metabolically active biosystems such as bacteria, yeasts, and red cells. This paper describes 2 incidents, case reports 1 and 2, in which the health effects experienced by correspondents to drive C.J. Schilling, 39 St. David's Square, Westferry Road, London, E14 War, UK. Tel +44 02077190444, fax +44 02077190445. Email philippej@all.com. Antenna engineers working on transmitter masts suggest they were exposed to levels of very high-frequency VHF radio frequency radiation 100 MHz, which may have been significantly higher than the National Radio-Tie-in Protection Board NRP by registered sign investigation level of 100 VIM or 27 W/M. Case Report 1. 4 men designated A, B, C, and D in the text, who were all experienced antenna engineers, were employed between the 9th of March and 13th July 1995, installing and servicing a transmission mast supporting VHF and UHF antennas. The 4 engineers reported various symptoms towards the end of and following this 3-month work period, and continued to have symptoms and signs of varying degrees 4 years later. These symptoms are similar to those elicited following previous incidents of acute exposure to radio frequency. All 4 men had been extremely fit in order to meet the physical demands of frequent climbs of several hundred meters. All had been required to undergo an annual medical examination to ensure they were fit to climb, which included an examination by a doctor, a static ECG, full blood picture, and biochemistry. No notable health problems had ever been detected for any of the men, and none had a history of ill health or injury, except for one man D, who in the 2 years preceding this incident had symptoms that may have been due to the effects of exposure to radio frequency. All 4 men had full blood pictures, and ZZ's 18Q09000, Jasenbek QGZ spoke L/P/L/Oak/E109/Puso/T0 Odnavol POE/ Estaje Papoyu Mog. 50 Ok Med Val. 52,000. Biochemistry performed within 2 weeks of the incident. The results were all within the normal range. Figure 1 is a diagrammatic representation of the transmitter mast and the chair used for transporting engineers and equipment up the mast to the area where work is to be undertaken. The chair is raised or lowered by the winch bond, a 13 mm wire rope attached to the chair via a pulley at the top of the mast. The winch bond runs down the center of the structure close to the metal ladders not illustrated, used to climb to platforms at various levels. The pilot bond is used to keep the chair in position as it is raised and lowered, and to anchor it when it is in position. The transmitter mast is an open lattice triangular structure 305 m high, a single side of which is shown diagrammatically in the figure. The BBC National VHF radio antenna panels are at the level 190 to 214 meters. This consists of 2 transmitter stacks. The upper stack has 3 transmitters of 17 kW 12 kilowatts and 18.6 kilowatt. The lower stack consists of 4 transmitters, 2 of 10 kilowatts, 1 of 12 kilowatts, and 1 of 18.6 kilowatt. On reduced power, the upper stack is isolated and the lower stack operates on half power, a total transmit power of about 25 kilowatts. A survey had been carried out in 1990 concentrating on the BBC National VHF aerial stack and the NTL and BBC UHF tie antennas at the top of the mast. On full power, measurements of between 20 and 60 W/m were obtained in front of the ladder, and peak readings of 120 W/m were recorded 60 centimeters behind the center of each screen. On the platform above the FM national radio antenna, recordings of 20 to 30 WIM were ob-tained in section -10 W/m. On the platform below, it was concluded that it was only safe for staff to climb through the VHF antennas when they were on reduced power or off. Prior to work starting, an RF hazard assessment was made and fields of 150 volts V/m were discovered within the mast behind the FM national radio antenna. No high fields were found when the chair Fig. 1 passed in front of the FM national radio antenna. It was decided that personnel climbing past these antennas, about 30 meters high, should do so without stopping, and the transmitters should always be on reduced power. Figure 1. Diagrammatic representation of the antenna mast and rig. Main UHF antenna chair. Pilot bond. FM national radio antennas FF. Winch bond 4. Winch. Man, age 34, had worked as a rigger for 14 years. He started to feel unwell on 23 May 1995, after several weeks working about a meter from the BBC FM national radio antennas. He had used the ladder at the center of the mast to climb up and down through the BBC FM national radio antennas, and the winch bond Fig. 1 had been located in front of the ladder between his legs. As he climbed down on the 23rd of May, his equipment bag repeatedly became caught up in the BBC FM national radio stack. He had to move off the ladder several times to unhook the bag, thus getting within a few centimeters of the back of the antennas and touching the outside of the feeder's cables, deploying the antennas from the transmitters at the base of the mast. After work on the 23rd of May, he experienced low back pain, nausea and diarrhea with general malaise. Although his symptoms gradually got worse, he continued to work on this part of the structure until the 30th of May, when he began working lower down the mast about 100 meters below the antenna, as he felt that he might have been affected by radio frequency. On 2 June 1995 he went on sick leave. I first saw Manna 7 weeks after the onset of his symptoms. He described hazing of his vision after the incident, as though there were a thin film over his eyes. This had improved slightly, but he continued to have difficulty seeing his television screen and reading. A famous fanatic, mountain cycling 8 or 9 miles and performing 150 press-ups a day, as well as his climbing duties, he now suffered from shortness of breath walking upstairs. He had experienced paresthesia in the left foot for 6 weeks, involving the big and second toe and the middle of the dorsal surface of the foot adjacent to the big toe, paresthesia in the wrists and hands for 2 weeks, which had spread to the fingertips, and for 1 week paresthesia in his right big toe and second toe. His sleep pattern was very poor, and the paresthesia woke him at night. He had headaches which he described as pressure all over his skull, made worse by exposure to sunlight, driving and watching television. He had loose stools 10 minutes after each meal. Although he had never had diarrhea in the past, he complained of aching and numbness in the testicles. He stated that his symptoms had not improved in the weeks he had been off work. On examination, Manor had slight reduction in pinprick of the left foot involving the medial side of the foot and the middle second and big toe. He had similar, but less marked findings in the right foot. He had slight loss of pinprick involving the testicles and penis, and of the hands in a glove distribution. The rest of his central nervous system was normal, as were his cardiovascular and respiratory systems. His abdomen was normal with no localized tenderness. A neurologist elicited the same history, but did not find any objective deficit of his sensation. End showed abnormalities described as of an extremely minor nature, with slight delay in the conduction of his median nerves at both wrists. Ulnar and radial nerves were normal, and there was no abnormality in the lower limbs. The conclusion was that the results were compatible with a bilateral partial lesion of the median nerves at the level of the wrists. ZZS 18400000J Senbek QGZKL/GP/L/Oak/E10N/Purd 0/Rudinalweight/Esdaiway Papayumog. I reviewed Manor in September 1995, 4 months after the onset of symptoms. He said that the paresthesia in his hands was worse, and he had regular night sweats and nightmares. He continued to have loose stools 10–15 minutes after meals, and was suffering from severe lassitude and constant headaches. Testing his hands and feet for pinprick sensation produced the same result as before. In December 1995, ECG and echocardiogram revealed no significant abnormality. Manor returned to work on light duties in May 1996, but stopped after 5 weeks because he could not cope. He was treated with antidepressants, but continued to have nightmares, although these were less frequent, being about twice a week instead of every night. He continued to complain of lassitude, inability to undertake strenuous physical effort, and lack of concentration. In November 1996, 17 months after the incident, he started work again on light duties, making tea, answering the phone, and collecting items of equipment. I saw him again in March 1997 and May 1998, when it appeared he had made no progress, and was having regular absences from work. By March 1999 he had made slight progress, and was performing a wider range of light duties, and having less time off. Manby, aged 55, had been an antenna rigger for 38 years. He had worked intermittently on the transmission mast since the beginning of March. On the 7th of July he was about 2 meters above a newly installed national FM radio reserve antenna, which had not been connected to the system, when he had a sudden feeling of warmth along his left side, and his left eye watered heavily for about 20 minutes. He had difficulty focusing, but this improved the following day. He experienced numbness of the left cheek, soreness of the left leg, and some paresthesia in the tips of the fingers of the right hand, and a similar, but less marked sensation in the left hand. He had pain in the left frontotemporal region and persistent pain and numbness in the left cheek. He had pain in the lower abdomen, which was worse lying down and exacerbated by turning and twisting, keeping him awake at night. He had numbness of the lateral aspect of the left leg, and of the third and fourth toe of the left foot. He had had to stop work immediately. He had experienced severe lassitude since the incident and was very tired in the evenings, going to bed at 9:00 p.m. instead of his usual time of 11:00 p.m. The persistent frontotemporal head-ache had improved slightly by the time I saw him on the 2nd August 1999. He described it as a persistent ache, with very sharp intermittent pains lasting for a few seconds on most days. On examination he had a small area of diminished pinprick about 2 centimeters in diameter, overlying the zygoma on the left. The third and fourth left toe had slightly diminished pinprick. He complained of an aching sensation deep in the left thigh and had pain on resisted flexion of the left hip in the thigh and in the groin. The rest of his examination was satisfactory. A neurologist elicited a reduction in the quality of pinprick and light touch in an area of about 2.5 cm in diameter on the skin overlying the left zygoma. There were no other objective neurological signs. End nerve conduction studies were within normal limits. I reviewed C.J. Schilling, exposure to very high-frequency RF radiation 51. Man B on the 21st of September, 11 weeks after the incident. His left leg was still a problem with paresthesia in the toes of his left foot. He described a sensation as though something was penetrating his left thigh and then spreading down the outside of his leg. On closer questioning, it transpired that he had worn a tool belt, so that the tools hung down the lateral aspect of his left thigh. These may have acted as a conductor for the RF, resulting in high exposure in his left thigh. He continued to complain of pain in the left temple, although less severe, and the lower abdominal pain had improved. He was still suffering from marked lassitude. I reviewed man B 17 weeks and again 11 months after the incident. His left thigh continued to be a problem, as did a throbbing sensation in the left side of his head with dysesthesia of the side of his face. He continued to suffer from lassitude and tiredness, having to go to bed early, stop work every 2 hours for 30 minutes to rest, and take frequent absences from work to recuperate. In March 1997 his symptoms had not improved, and he retired from work on the grounds of ill health. He was reviewed again in August 1997, when he said his headaches were as bad as ever and there had been no improvement in his sleep disturbance. In March 1999 he reported that he had made no further progress. Man C, aged 32 years, had been working on the mast since 9 March 1995. He had been a specialist antenna rigger for 8 years. I first saw him on 11 July 1995. Between the 26th of May and the 2nd of June, he had suffered lethargy and general malaise. On the 2nd of June, he woke up with a severe headache all over his head, and as the day progressed became very tired. He noticed that when he was watching television it was as though there was a film over his eyes. He developed a lumbar backache, and 24 hours later his stools were loose. His backache worsened over the next 48 hours and was very painful for about 2% weeks, and then eased off. When I first saw him 5 weeks after the incident, he still had back stiffness in the morning, numbness in his hands on waking, and complained of insomnia, sleeping at most 4 to 5 hours a night because of anxiety and headaches. He had no past history of anxiety or depression. He had given up alcohol because of an episode of severe headaches and vomiting after drinking 4 pints of beer, modest by his standards, over a period of 5 to 6 hours. Clinical examination was satisfactory, including the peripheral nervous system. His back movements were full, and there was no localized tenderness. A neurologist found no abnormalities apart from a very minor reduction of pinprick appreciation corresponding to the ulnar distribution in the left hand. T saw man C for review 4 months after the incident, when he had been back at work for a week on light duties. He continued to suffer from a headache, a feeling of constant pressure over the temples, made worse by hot weather, bright lights and television. He was still suffering from considerable lethargy, but was able to walk about 200 m without feeling short of breath. Over the ensuing 12 months he reported gradual progress, and by August 1996 was feeling better, and had started to climb again. He continued to suffer from generalized headaches, but the severe headaches had eased to 2 or 3 times a week. He still had loose stools, but much less. ZZs 184000 QGZZBGPL/GP/L/OK/E10/Pure 0/29 Dnorwapio/ Papijamog 52 Okup Medvol 52,000. Than before. He continued to have paresthesia in both hands, but no numbness. Although he made significant progress since the incident with further improvement since August 1996, in March 1999 he stated that he was still not as fit as he was prior to the incident. Mandy, aged 54 years, had worked as a rigger and as a specialist antenna rigger for 36 years, and on this particular mast, intermittently for several years. He had suffered loose stools and paresthesia in both hands and feet since an incident in 1993. In 1994 he had worked for a week on the mast with the aerials on reduced power and had handled the winch bond. He resumed work on the mast in February 1995. By mid-April he was suffering from headaches as well as paresthesia, numbness of the right side of his head, and loose stools. On the 10th of July his symptoms forced him to stop work. I first saw him on August 1995. He confirmed he had been suffering from paresthesia in both hands and feet for about 2 years, the symptoms extending to the mid-forearm and mid-shin. For the last 2 months he had experienced paresthesia and numbness on the right side of his head with an aching sensation all over his head. Examination was satisfactory except for a slight reduction in pinprick appreciation in a glove distribution in his hands. A neurologist confirmed the reduced appreciation of pinprick distally in the arms and legs with absent ankle reflexes. Nerve conduction studies confirmed a significant motor peripheral neuropathy with some chronic reinnervation. He was investigated for the possible causes of peripheral neuropathy, including diabetes, all of which were negative. I reviewed Mandy in September 1995, when he said that although he continued to experience paresthesia in his hands and feet, he was definitely better and was at the point of returning to work. In August 1996 he had definitely made progress, coping satisfactorily with his workload but climbing much less than previously and to a maximum of about 100 m. He continued to suffer from paresthesia in his hands and had had a follow-up consultation with the neurologist, who confirmed that his peripheral nerve symptoms and signs were much the same. His symptoms were the same in July 1997. This man spent less time on the mast than the other engineers, but was involved to a greater extent in operating the winch system and may have been exposed via the winch bond. Case Report 2. The transmitter mast involved in this incident is a square open lattice structure 170 m high. The men were transported in a chair to the 135 m level of the mast. The rigging of the chair with its winch and pilot bond was essentially the same as shown in Fig. 1, with the winch bond arm running down the center of the structure close to the ladders. Work was undertaken between 24 June 1999 and 11 July 1996 on the installation of a new UHF TV antenna for Channel 5, which was located between 135 and 133 m. Below this at 132-129 meters was a shielded Vodafone antenna, and at 127-116 meters a VHF antenna consisting of 4 panels servicing national and local FM radio. A survey was carried out on 19 June 1996, prior to starting work. All measurements were below the NRPB investigation levels for VHF 100 MHz apart from those nearest to the top tier of the VHF antennas, just below the part of the structure on which the men were working. These measurements just exceeded 100 volts V/m, the NRPB investigation level for 100 MHz. Because the antenna engineers had to pass the VHF antenna panels as they ascended to reach the UHF antenna they were working on, these panels were put on reduced power so that all levels were below the NRPB investigation level. Measurements were also taken in the vicinity of the winch bond and levels varied between 20 and 150 volts V/m. All levels reduced to 20 volts V/m at a distance of 10 centimeters from the winch bond. The winch bond was moved so that it was not near the ladder used for climbing on the inside of the mast. 6 men worked on the UHF antenna from the 24th of June to 11th July 1996. 2 suffered no symptoms at all. 2 suffered from nausea and what they described as a fuzzy head, but made a rapid and complete recovery. 2 men had severe symptoms from which they continue to suffer. The 2 men with less severe symptoms spent similar periods of time on this work, but their duties were different and they were located at different parts of the structure. It is likely that they spent less time inside the mast and possibly as a result, less time in the vicinity of the winch bond. The two men who suffered severe symptoms are designated X and Y in the text. On the 11th of July, a visiting antenna engineer recorded an instantaneous reading of 16.5 mW/cm. On a general microwave 600 amperes GM 6000 alarm. A further instantaneous level of 25 mW/cm was recorded by a second engineer on a GM 600 alarm. Neither of these high readings was confirmed using a minute meter. The measurements with the minute were similar to those of the initial survey. It was concluded that the high readings were likely to have been spurious. It is recognized that high readings can be initiated on the GM600A when it is moved through a field, and that they decay very quickly. A further survey was carried out 7 weeks after the work was completed. In one important respect, which may have a bearing on the levels of exposure to RF, the rigging of the mast was different. The main winch bond and the pilot bond had been removed on completion of the work. The winch bond may have acted as a conductor for RF, thus irradiating those touching it or working close to it. Man X stated that the winch bond had been touching the right side of his body while he was working on the structure, even though it had been relocated. Measurements were carried out using a Rayham isotopic meter and a Me1/4, equivalent to a minute. The measurements recorded were maximum readings and the majority were close coupled, i.e. taken very close to and with the probe head in contact with mast bracings, antenna splitters, seal work, etc. A maximum value of 194 volts V/m was obtained at the height of 130 m. Of the 26 measurements, 4 were in excess of 100 volts V/m, 106, 137, 137 and 194. ZS 18 Co 9000 Simbuk 9 GZ Spopel/P/L/Oak/E109/Purd 0/T09 Dinoval POE/Esdaiwe Papua Moog. Man X, aged 48 years, had worked as rigger for 17 years and as a foreman for 4 years and had no past history of serious illness. He worked mostly at the 135 N level for 8 of the 18 days for a total of 34.5 H. The maximum period worked was 9 hours and the shortest 1.5 H. His symptoms started 6 days after commencing work, 30th June 1996, which he described as a strange flu-like feeling and as though one side of his body had been affected. The right-hand side of his body felt tender to touch, and he was experiencing tingling sensations throughout. He had soreness of the external auditory meatus with discomfort inside his mouth plus aching teeth on the right, and paresthesia of the fingers of his right hand. Approximately 36 hours later, he developed a throbbing sensation in his right eye and experienced nausea plus headaches, which he described as jabbing intermittently in the right occipito-frontal region. This was coupled with a persistent dull headache and sensation of feeling hot. He felt as though his right arm was weak. On the 8th of July, he felt lifeless and nauseated. Any movements were debilitating and he was disinclined to go to work. When he arrived at work, he said that he felt so unwell that he was unable to ascend and left the site to see a local doctor. He returned to site and continued to work. His symptoms persisted and he was relieved when the job was finished on the 11th of July, by which time he was having difficulty in concentrating. After a week off work, he attempted to start a new project. By this time he was experiencing severe pains in the right loin. His concentration had deteriorated further and colleagues noticed that he was not performing satisfactorily. On the 29th of July he stopped work, and has not worked since. I first saw him 1 month after the incident, when he said he was still experiencing pain in the right eye and the right side of his face. He had a fuzzy tingling sensation around the mouth and over the right side of his face, and a similar sensation in his right hand, forearm, calf and foot. In the 2 weeks preceding this consultation he had developed soreness in both loins, the right being worse than the left, and was kept awake by these symptoms. He had had severe nausea, which had lasted about 2 weeks but had improved. He noticed that about 10 days after he had finished the job, the skin on his hard palate had peeled off, and after a further 4 days peeled off again. Examination revealed an area of reduced pinprick sensation on his right cheek about 3.5 centimeter in diameter. The rest of his examination was satisfactory. Routine biochemistry and full blood picture were within normal limits. At follow-up in October 1996, Man X had been having episodes of hypersensitivity of the right hemi-cranium and face with a tingling and fuzzy sensation around his mouth, which had become continuous, occasionally spreading to the right side of his face and left cheek. There was no specific precipitating factor, and the sensations lasted for up to 12-18h. The constant deep pain within his NGHD ear following the incident improved after about a fortnight, but returned intermittent-tently in association with severe headaches. The nausea and general lethargy improved over a period of 2 months, but the lightheadedness on sudden head movement continued. In the latter part of 1996 he started to C.J. Schilling, exposure to very high-frequency RF radiation 53. Experience a throbbing pain in the right testicle 2 or 3 times per week lasting 2 to 3 min in association with pain in the night loin and coupled with pain radiating down the medial aspect of the right thigh and calf. He had a full investigation of his urinary tract which revealed no abnormality. He continues to experience pain in the right loin, which intermittently radiates to the left side of the abdomen. Since the incident, his concentration and memory for recent events had been impaired, and he and his wife were having to use lists to remind him of his daily routine. His family described him as easygoing but had changed to a person who is depressed, moody and irritable, all resulting in tensions in his relationships. In June 1997 he had a particularly severe episode of pain and paresthesia in his right face, hand and arm, the worst episode to date, and which was not relieved by morphine by mouth prescribed for particularly bad attacks. He feels this episode was precipitated by attempting to assist a friend on the construction of a shed. He now takes only short walks and does not perform any strenuous physical tasks. Over 3 years after the incident, Mr. X's symptoms have not significantly improved. He is still off work due to ill health. Man Y, aged 31 years, had been a rigger for his current company for 5 years and had no past history of serious illness. He worked on different areas of the mast for 9 days over a period of 18 days and a total of 53 hours. The maximum period worked in any one day was 10 hours and the minimum 2 hours. I first saw Mr. Y on the 6th of August. He finished work on the 11th of July. A week preceding his last day on this job he had frontal headaches and dizziness. The headaches became worse the day after he finished work and both legs felt warm on the inner aspects of his thighs. 2 days later he noticed pins and needles and tenderness on the left side of his face, pain in his left eye and around his left ear. He felt nauseated, dizzy, weak, and tired. He was unable to walk more than about 200 yards without having to stop because his legs felt weak. He had episodes of loss of power in his left arm and leg lasting a few minutes and continued to experience paresthesia in the whole of his left leg and left arm until his first consultation, approximately 3 weeks after cessation of work. He was also experiencing a feeling of pulsation in his head. Examination revealed slight tenderness in front of the left ear and just below the prominence of the left zygoma and anteriorly, suggesting a distribution in the area supplied by the middle branch of the trigeminal nerve. There was slight impairment of light touch in the left leg, arm and face, but no impairment of pinprick sensation. There was a slight diminution in light touch over the lateral aspect of the left upper and forearm and the inner aspect of the left leg below the knee and involving the medial aspect of the left ankle and left foot when compared with the right side. There were no differences in pinprick sensation and the reflexes were normal and present in the arms and legs. 1 month later a neurological examination was normal. A magnetic resonance brain scan in October 1996 was reported as normal. ZZ's 18Q09Q00, Asamba QGSBOP/L/OAK/E1IN/PUSO/CHU Dino ol POE/SDNI way PPG mod 54 OCUP med vol 52000. On the 15th of October, there had been no improvement in his symptoms, and the frontal headaches continued to be constant with severe exacerbation lasting about 2 hours every 3 to 4 days. He was suffering from malaise and exhaustion and was unable to walk for more than about 600 yards. His sleep pattern was impaired and he complained of a deep-seated pain in both thighs and pain in his left arm as though it was in his bones. On 12 December 1996 he complained that the light-headedness was worse, and he felt unsteady most of the time. His symptoms were exacerbated on lying down, getting up and moving his head. His headaches had spread to become frontoparietal and occipital, and he was experiencing numbness and paresthesia of the left side of his head and face. He continued to experience pain and tenderness in front of and behind his left ear. He continued to complain of numbness of the left side involving his head, arm and leg, which was worse about once or twice a week and lasted about 45 minutes in this severe form, starting in the head and traveling down the left side of the body. He was able to do very little at home and was angry and depressed. On 25 April 1997 he said he had made no progress. 18 months after the incident, Mr. Y was still severely disabled with general malaise, lassitude, weakness, inability to undertake strenuous physical tasks, suffering from episodes of numbness, paresthesia and weakness in the left arm and leg, and persistent headaches with frequent exacerbation. There had been only a slight improvement in his condition since he was first seen in August 1996. He returned to work on light duties on 18 August 1997. 3 years after the incident he is still deployed, on light duties. Discussion. Case Report 1. There are considerable uncertainties about the level of exposure of these 4 men. Those likely to have had the highest exposure were Man A and Man B, who were working regularly on the mast in the vicinity of antenna panels, feeders and splitters, which may have been faulty, and close to the winch bond, which may have been conducting RF. They have had the severest symptoms, which have not improved with TME. A survey carried out after the development of health problems showed typical RF values of between 100 and 250 Vm with a maximum of 400 volts V/M. A detailed research study carried out by an outside consultant showed a maximum value of 300 volts V/M and a maximum estimated power density of 200 W/M. Most of the measurements were below the NRPB investigation levels for VHF of 100 volts V/M and 27 W/M. High readings were obtained by holding meters touching or almost touching the winch bond in the vicinity of the BBC VHF antenna. These readings dropped to ambient levels within 10 centimeters of the bond. The manufacturers of the meters stipulate that they should not be used within 15 centimeters of metal objects because interaction between the meter head and metal causes the meter to behave erratically. It is worth noting that, as these men climbed the structure, they described the winch bond as touching either the front or back of their body. The measurements taken generally indicated compliance with the NRPB investigation level. Some X-C did this, but do not appear to have been sufficiently high to produce the level of ill health experienced. The general symptoms of malaise and lassitude, and the more specific symptoms of headache, and the symptoms and signs pointing to peripheral nerve involvement, are similar to those observed in the 3 men exposed to RF at 785 MHz. A and B appear to have been subject to higher exposures than C and D, which is consistent with the nature of their duties. It is of considerable concern that A and B should still be suffering from symptoms after 4 years, including loss of stamina and severe malaise, lassitude and headaches, which show no signs of remitting. In the absence of evidence to the contrary, it is assumed that RF was the cause and either higher fields were present but not detected, or an as yet unknown mechanism of RF exposure came into play. Case Report 2. Why should Mr. X and Y have had health problems when 2 of the other 4 men working on the same structure were unaffected and 2 only slightly affected? The significant difference appears to be that X and Y spent more time, possibly 10 hours each, in the middle of the structure where they stood at the top of the feeders where the splitters are assembled, and were standing either touching or within centimeters of the main winch bond. The other 4 men worked most of the time outside the mast and not in the vicinity of the winch bond, a meter away. Y's symptoms started approximately a week later than X. Y took over from X on or about the 4th of July when X's symptoms first started. He then worked in X's previous position on the inside of the mast and close to the winch bond. The winch bond was on X's right, which is the side of his body that experienced most symptoms. The winch bond was relocated to reduce the possibility of the transmission of radio frequency in the vicinity of the engineers, but X stated that the winch bond could not be moved more than a few centimeters, the maximum being about 23 centimeters at any one time. For a substantial part of the time he was either touching it, or very close to it. Measurements of radio frequency at the site prior to starting work and on 11 July 1996 failed to show levels significantly above the NRPB investigation levels. The most detailed survey carried out after the incident on 28 August 1996 produced similar findings, but the winch bond was no longer in place. General considerations. There are interesting similarities in case reports 1 and 2 in the acute and chronic health effects reported and in the exposure circumstances. Winch bonds were present in both and may have been responsible for conducting ZZs 18Q09Q00, Asamba QG/L/Oak/E10N/Q/T0 Odino Olepio/S-Daiwe Papao Radio frequency radiation resulting in levels of exposure significantly higher than might have been expected. Detailed inquiries were made whether any of these men may have been exposed to other physical or chemical agents. There was no evidence that they had suffered from infections. Their blood pictures were normal. In the absence of any evidence to the contrary and based on the pattern of symptoms observed, it appears that the effects that these 6 men experienced were associated with exposure to radiofrequency radiation, despite the fact that measurements taken before and after the periods of possible exposure failed to confirm values significantly in excess of the NRPB investigation level. The symptoms and signs are consistent with effects on the nervous system, with central effects resulting in headache, fatigue and malaise. Peripheral effects result minusing in paresthesia, dysesthesia, impaired perception of light, touch and pain. Effects on the ganglia of autonomic system either in the neck or splanchnic region causing diarrhea. It is possible that diarrhea is caused by a direct effect on the cells of the lining of the gastro-intestinal tract. Conclusions. 1. It is difficult to predict levels of exposure to radio-frequency radiation on masts with live antennas. Variations arise from faults on the antennas, the minor cells, their connections to the transmitters and the interactions between the exposure sources and the transmission towers, and between the equipment being used by the engineers and the engineers themselves. Investigations into the sources of possible exposure show that minor changes in the position of equipment can result in major changes to the local pattern of radiofrequency radiation. 2. Radiofrequency radiation is difficult to measure in the near field, even in ideal conditions. 3. Radiofrequency exposures at 100 MHz VHF are not detectable by the body unless they are significantly higher than the NRPB investigation levels, and as a result can go undetected for relatively long periods, which makes the task of minimizing the risk of high levels of exposure all the more problematic. 4. The effects of exposure to radiofrequency radiation, particularly those on the nervous system, appear to be greater than would be expected from tissue heating. The question arises as to whether or not the NRPB investigation levels based on calculations of power absorption in the human body expressed a specific absorption rate, give sufficient protection against the type of effects that have been experienced by the men in these case reports. 5. Further research needs to be undertaken into systems of monitoring radiofrequency fields and into the acute and long-term effects of exposure to radiofrequency. 6. In liaison with the communications industry, and NRPB should undertake a review of live working on transmission masts supporting VHF and UHF antennas. C.J. Schilling, Exposure to Very High Frequency RF Radiation 55. Acknowledgement. The author thanks Mrs. E. Hunninger of Canning Press for editing the text. References. 1. Schilling C.J. Effects of acute exposure to ultra-high radio-frequency radiation on 3 antenna engineers. Yen number Okup Environ Med 1997 54, 281-284. 2. Michaelson S. Elsony Interaction of Non-Modulated and Pulse-Modulated Radiofrequency Fields with Living Matter. In Polk C. Post OE, eds. Handbook of Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields. Boca Raton CRC Press, 1996-11. 3. Hocking Preliminary Report, Symptoms Associated with Mobile Phone Use. OCUP Med 1998 48 357 to 360. 4. Braun's Rockledge C. Resting blood pressure increase during exposure to a radiofrequency electromagnetic field. Lancet 1998 351 1857 to 1858. 5. Highland G.J. Non-thermal bioeffects induced by low-intensity microwave irradiation of living systems. Eng Syed 7 1998, 7 261 to 269. 6. National Radiation Protection Board. Statement on restrictions on human exposure to static and time-varying electromagnetic fields and radiation. Documents of the NRPB 1993, 4-5. Appendix. Summary of the effects of exposure to radio frequency at 100 MHz, and some of the difficulties encountered in its measurement. The term radio frequency when applied to the electromagnetic spectrum covers the frequency range 3 kHz - 300 GHz. The range 30 - 300 MHz is denoted very high frequency VHF. The effect of exposure to VHF radio frequency is primarily that of heating, in which the rate of energy absorption per unit mass of body tissue is described as the specific absorption rate SAR expressed as watts per kilogram W/kg, and depends on the frequency Hertz, and the power density expressed in watts per square meter W/m, or milliwatts per square centimeter MW/cm. 1 milliwatt/cm equals 10 watts per square meter 10 W/m7. Power density can be described as the power crossing a unit area normal to the direction of wave propagation. The deposition of RF energy in body tissue varies with their absorption characteristics, which depend to a considerable extent on their water content. Tissue such as blood, skin, muscle, brain, and peripheral nerves will absorb much more energy than fat and bone, with the result that much of the incident radiofrequency energy tends to pass through the surface of fatty tissue to be deposited in deeper tissue such as muscle and brain. The degree to which radiofrequency penetrates the body depends also on the frequency. Figure 2 shows that based on the absorption characteristics of the human body, radiofrequency can be subdivided into 4 regions. The frequency involved in the exposure of the antenna engineer's 100 MHz is ZZ's 18Q09Q00, Usambak QGSBOPL//Oak/E1ON/Puso/Chu-Dino-Ol-POE/SDini Way-PPG-MOG 56 or Cup Med Vol 52000. In the whole body resonance range, the wavelength at 100 MHz is 3 meters, which allows the RF radiation to resonate within the body. Resonance occurs at half the wavelength and results in optimal absorption of energy. Because of the even deposition of energy at 100 MHz, those exposed accidentally are much less likely to be aware of the situation than at the higher ultra-high frequencies 300 - 3000 MHz used for TV broadcast. -ing when heating of the skin and superficial tissues results in a sensation of warming and can result in skin erythema. The result is that it is possible for people to be exposed to levels of RF at 100 MHz in excess of the NRPB investigation level, without being aware of it at the time of the exposure. Radiofrequency results in an electric and a magnetic field. Meters used to measure RF fields generally measure the electric field pound expressed as volts per meter V/m, although some express the E field in terms of equivalent plane wave power density in MW/cm, or W/m. Instruments, which measure magnetic field H, measure amps per meter/m, although these meters often express this in terms of equivalent plane wave power density. Radiofrequency fields can be divided into near and far fields, the border between them being approximately a/2a, whereas the longest dimension of the antenna and 1 is the wavelength. Far fields can be predicted quite accurately from the power of the antenna and the electric. Figure 2. Variation of normalized specific absorption rate with frequency and related absorption characteristics in living organisms. Reproduced, with permission from WHO Environmental Criteria 137. Electromagnetic fields 300 Hz to 300 GHz. 1993, 76. Sub-resonance resonance range hotspot surf. Range whole body partial range absorb. Body range THT. Normalized specific absorption rate Wiki per W/m. Who 92,115. Frequency megahertz. And magnetic fields are in phase, and measuring one allows the other to be determined. In the near field this relationship breaks down, and it is necessary to measure both components to establish RF power. This is difficult to achieve in the field. Additionally, on transmitter masts the lattice structure antennas and feeders can cause complex reflections and fields, which can give rise to local hot spots typically the size of a football giving meter indications 2 or 3 times ambient. ZSAS 18Q09Q00, Asambat QGSBOP/L/OAK/E10N/Q/T0 Odino Olepio/S Daiwe Papo Emoji.